Hello, I'm Christina Davis, Director of the Program on U.S. Japan Relations. It's my great pleasure to welcome you here and those of you online joining us for a seminar on the economic weapon, the rise of sanctions as a tool of modern war. Sanctions have indeed become a very frequent tool of statecraft in the United States. We've been following those applied against Iran for a long period against its nuclear weapons program and support for terrorist groups. We've seen sanctions imposed against China for its violation of human rights in Xinjiang. And of course, the brutal Russian invasion of Ukraine led to a wide group of countries, including Japan and the United States, launching a stringent set of sanctions. As of August this year, over 30 countries have imposed sanctions against Russia, including energy imports being restricted, financial transactions blocked, and shipments of key products stopped. We've also seen beyond government sanctions, firms that have joined on, going even beyond governments, with over 1,000 foreign companies halting their operations in Russia. The challenge is that while sanctions are increasingly being used, we don't know how well they work, because they often are being used as a convenient substitute for military action. Sometimes that means they're being used too often. Sometimes they're being used as a normative statement when you really don't care enough to do something else. And when they've been imposed in full force, they cause devastating impact on civilian populations with starvation, such as there was much reflection after the sanctions against Iraq caused a humanitarian crisis in the 1990s, that this was disproportional. And there was an evolution to have sanctions that were smart sanctions with more targeted application, lists of specific individuals, firms, ships that should not be traded with in order to limit the spillover harming humans. Civilians, non-military targets. But of course, that reduces their role as an overwhelming weapon. And so overall, the challenge with sanctions is when and how should they be applied? And for us as scholars and practitioners, do they work? And in order to understand whether it works, you have to think about, what was the goal? Was it to remove capacity? Was it to deter other countries in future crises? Or was it just to make a moral statement for your domestic public? And if we think, did it work? Was it effective? You have to think about sanctions relative to if it were military or doing nothing. So frankly, the challenge of that evaluation has meant that much of the social science evaluation of sanctions has come up with mixed results, with some saying they are effective, some they're not effective, some coming up with a nuanced explanation of what are the conditions that make them more effective. It's a really important question. It's timeless and immediate. Today, we are really fortunate that we have the best speaker to help us make sense of these developments with a historical perspective and connecting to the current events that we are all following so closely. Mulder is Assistant Professor of History, Milstein Faculty Fellow at Cornell University. His broader research addresses modern European international history with an emphasis on political, economic, intellectual dimensions. And today we're bringing him here to connect his research from a recent book, The Economic Weapon, The Rise of Sanctions as a Tool of Modern War. This book was published by Yale University Press this year. I highly recommend it. It's extremely well written and compelling work as a scholar, and the implications are clearly laid out to help those of us studying policy. This is a history of the interwar origins of economic sanctions, looking at how they acted as an extension of the logic of total war that developed during this period. The threat of devastating economic sanctions that would harm the entire population was intended as a form of deterrence. And Mulder in this book shows us how that threat was able to push some countries into pursuit of expansion and autarky. This logic has been noted especially for the reaction of Japan. In the introduction to the book, he writes that rather than stopping the nationalist tide and the risk of war that it entailed, sanctions reinforced it. The insights of the book are directly relevant to the challenges we face today, highlights how sanctions can aggravate tensions within globalization. For those of us following in East Asia, we must think about whether sanctions against Russia today will deter China from use of force in Taiwan or the South China Seas conflict, or instead push China towards self-reliance. Nicholas has indeed been connecting these themes in his scholarship to policy. He wrote an editorial published in the Wall Street Journal in April titled, "Don't Expect Sanctions to Win the Ukraine War." This seminar today is part of our special series on Japanese economic statecraft, co-sponsored by the International Security Program of the Belfer Center, Science of International Affairs at the Harvard Kennedy School. Before we turn over to our speaker, I want to briefly highlight our event for next week on economic policy agenda in the Indo-Pacific region, when Aaron Forsberg will be joined by the former Consul General Rokoichiro Michi. Actually, I said next week, but it's November 28th. Apologies. And this will be an evening event because we are joining guests. Aaron Forsberg will be joining us from the U.S. Embassy in Tokyo, and Michi-san is also now positioned in the Cabinet Secretariat in Tokyo. Hope you can join us for that event. But first today, let us turn over. Please start your presentation.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Professor Davis, for that introduction. And I'd also very much like to thank the Weatherhead Center for organizing the logistics for this talk. It's a pleasure to be back at Harvard, and a particular pleasure to be speaking to scholars of East Asia, which is an area that is addressed in the book, not through any primary research focus of mine, but because I think it's very important to talk about the history and the use of sanctions in a truly international sense. It cannot be focused only on the North Atlantic, as it often is. So I'd like to talk today for about 25 to 30 minutes about some of the arguments in the book, but with a particular focus on how sanctions have always been related to the history of economic globalization. And that, I think, gives us a useful basis with which to compare sanctions in the interwar period and sanctions today. Oftentimes now we are hearing a lot about fears of deglobalization, whether sanctions go too far. And one of the things that I try to show in the book is that that's a very old discussion in many ways. There were already a lot of concerns over that in earlier periods. And as a result, I think we can use history to understand why sanctions have proven both so tremendous and powerful as a policy instrument, why they're so attractive, but also why they often have effects that are not quite the ones that policymakers intend them to have, creating new issues that then have to be addressed, and are in that sense really interesting, generative, but also destabilizing sometimes instruments of international politics. So I should first begin with the title of the book, actually, which gives me a convenient way into the argument of the book. The economic weapon is not a metaphor or something of that order that I coined. It's actually a term that was used in the early 20th century to describe a new policy instrument. And this was one of the things that really struck me as I started on the research of this project, reading through the archives of blockade ministries in the First World War, when the Allies were waging an economic war against the Central Powers, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. And the term that they began to use in the later years of the war for their use of economic blockade was the economic weapon. And they saw this as the situation on the battlefield did not yield conclusive results, devolved into trench warfare as an increasingly important tool in giving them ultimate victory. And the blockade in the First World War was a really enormous administrative undertaking. It was also very generative for institutional development, for the rise of modern statistical knowledge. because actually a lot of the institutions and surveillance mechanisms to map and measure trade between countries did not really exist before the First World War. There were some of these mechanisms, but the war massively increased and expanded the need to know exactly how much money was flowing across borders, how balance sheets were interconnected, what sort of flows and trade and exchanges connected countries. And in that sense, the blockade ministries, which were new ministries created in 1915-16 by Britain and France especially, are really interesting institutions in which to study something like the origins of modern international economic governance. So the world in the early 20th century, the world that the First World War broke out in, was, as many of us already know, a world that was very much globalized in economic and financial terms. It benefited from the transport revolution, the arrival of steam power, railways in the 19th century, telegraphic communications, undersea cables, which had interlinked financial markets, commodity trade, and many societies in this period had, for the first time at this scale, become very largely dependent on other countries for essential parts of their sustenance. So food, for example, the British Empire and Britain, the British Isles in 1914 import more than 2/3 of their food supply from overseas. But also energy, particularly coal and increasingly oil, and a number of other vital commodities. Money flows for many developing economies in this period also come from abroad. So we're dealing with a pattern, a structure of globalization that is recognizably similar to that of today. And much of that is due to a big boom in world trade in the second half of the 19th century. And this is the volume of trade. And I'll come back to that later on, why the volume of trade is actually the key benchmark that we need to look at if we discuss the history of globalization in the 19th and 20th centuries. But one other person that I want to bring in here is someone who is oftentimes described as a kind of prophet or analyst of globalization in this first great era of globalization, and that's Norman Angell, a British-American journalist educated in Switzerland, who after living in the UK moved to the United States in the late 19th century, and really was a kind of Thomas Friedman of his era, someone who made a lot of these arguments about globalization, bringing countries closer together, reducing distance between places, leading to generalized cultural exchange. And he's very well known for writing a book, Europe's Optical Illusion, or The Great Illusion, which said in 1910, 4 years before the First World War broke out, that it no longer made economic sense for countries to go to war. There was simply too much wealth at stake, too much prosperity that would be destroyed. And Angell's oftentimes cited, when you read histories of World War I, as a kind of useful idiot, as someone who described that this was great and would hold because why a war was so irrational. And then 4 years later, a war nonetheless broke out. But actually, I think he deserves much more credit as someone who understood that globalization was double-edged and who wasn't naive. He never said that war would never happen. He simply said it made little economic sense on a purely economic level to go to war. But he understood very well that globalization is bound up with power relations between countries and that the networks of globalization can be exploited. Only 1 year after the beginning of the war in 1915, he wrote this book, The World's Highway, which was subtitled Some Notes on America's Relation to Sea Power and Non-Military Sanctions for the Law of Nations. So Angell, more than 100 years ago, actually writes a book that is very similar in argument and analysis to some of the recent work on themes such as weaponized interdependence that some of you might be familiar with, Abram Newman and Henry Farrell. And one of the things that he did was to point to the blockade of the First World War and say that this actually provided the model for a new kind of global economic governance. What if you could think of an international organization that had that power of blockade? It could use it against individual countries that were aggressive, or it might destabilize things, and you could impose that blockade against them. And he said, actually, you wouldn't have to fight wars anymore, because that in the modern globalized world, that itself would be enough. Even the fear, the mere thought that this blockade would be imposed would be enough to keep the peace. And he wrote that we have little conception of the terror that such a policy might constitute to a nation. And if that machinery of non-intercourse sanctions policy is what he really means there. Or organized as it might be, there would be virtually no neutrals, and its effect in our world today would be positively terrifying. So this is a useful way to see how relevant actually these discussions in the 1910s are to our current discussions about sanctions. Angel said an economic world state, a kind of global economic government might be able to use this power. And indeed, there was an international organization after the First World War that did acquire this power, which is the League of Nations, created at the Paris Peace Conference in 1919. Its covenant contained an article 16, that is the first economic sanctions mechanism for an international organization in history. And at the time, this was described as the League's economic weapon. So the term sanctions, it sounds very legalistic, right? It's a kind of juristic term that lawyers use. You think about a court, a norm, a transgression, and then the imposition of some sanction to enforce that norm. But at the time, people were very clear-eyed and open and honest about the fact that the origins of this policy were wartime. It was a wartime policy of very brutal economic war against civilians, all out total war against enemy society from a distance by depriving them of every vital commodity. And this, it was thought, would be now the cornerstone of the League of Nations' ability to preserve world peace. We nowadays, oftentimes when the League of Nations is mentioned, right, it's as a failed international organization, the false start of international institutions in the early 20th century, which the United Nations after 1945 did manage to put on a much more solid footing. But it's an important experience to study, not least because it actually was the first organization to wield a policy instrument that very much is still around in the world today, but no longer really always as part of international governance, but also increasingly as part of coalitions of states, or even unilaterally by powerful states, particularly the US. One other important aspect of Article 16, and I describe this in the book as well, is that the economic weapon, so the instrumentalization of trade and the cutting off of trade as a threat in order to prevent countries going to war, was paired with another mechanism. This was also described at that time as a positive economic weapon. During World War I, as during World War II, there were big logistical operations going on to share resources. So the Allies had shipping committees. J.B. Martin at the history department here has a great book out, The Meddlers, which is also about the birth of global economic governance. And he shows how a lot of these institutions were also key to the development of international finance and thinking about development in the interwar period. But essentially, countries in World War I were sharing resources as well as depriving their enemies of it. And this positive philosophy was also mobilized in the kind of war prevention mindset. And the idea was that the aggressor would be cut off from global trade and finance. The victim of aggression would receive the resources and would be a beneficiary of pooled resources by the entire international community of the League of Nations. So, sorry. See how this, just click here. Oh, yes. Thanks. Yes. One other important thing to mention, however, is that the creation of the League of Nations did produce a shift in the international order. And this is quite an important one. It's not merely a legal one, but also a mental one. The point of sanctions was to prevent war from breaking out. Many people at the time thought, what would happen if we had had sanctions in 1914 during the July crisis after Franz Ferdinand was assassinated? Could we have just threatened to use them and thereby prevented this whole escalation cycle that ended up with war? The question and the difficult thing is, of course, that sanctions as a policy were modeled on a wartime instrument. So how do you have an instrument that preserves peace, but the actual implementation of it is modeled on something that you do during war? Can you keep the state of peace in existence? Can you preserve the state of peace legally, morally, diplomatically, while still threatening and also maybe using pressure that actually is part of the armory of wartime policies. That was the key difficulty. And what the founders of the League of Nations did, mainly the United States, Britain, and France, is that they legally created the opportunity for the League to impose full spectrum economic pressure without going to war, without declaring a state of war. This procedure would not initiate a state of war between the League and the target of the sanctions procedure. And this is really key because hitherto in history, economic pressure, using it for political purposes, is a very, very long history. But what makes modern economic sanctions special in particular is that you can use them without going to war with countries. That the use of export controls today against China or the imposition of embargoes against countries is not something that creates ipso facto a state of war. And it's in this gray area. And it's obviously not a fully pacific way of going about managing relations, but it does not constitute as such a form of war against which self-defense or retaliation, but in terms of international law, is allowed. And this is important because it means that sanctions were lifted from the domain of war into the domain of peace. And that also accounts for much of why they have been so controversial, why there's so much political discord about the use of sanctions, whether they're legitimate, because in a sense, rendering pacific of this instrument happened only 100 years ago. And it's an ongoing project to make that a legitimate move, because it was initiated at a moment when just 3 major and powerful countries did so. And the question is whether that legitimacy, particularly today, can hold. And I think that's key to the future of sanctions. So I just quickly want to go through some of the interwar cases about when sanctions worked and didn't work before rounding up with some conclusions. As Professor Davis mentioned, I argue in the book that sanctions were based on the experience of blockade in the First World War, and that had been such a terrifying and devastating experience to civilians. In Central Europe alone, about 300,000 civilians died of starvation, disease, and malnutrition in the years of the war. As much as 500,000 civilians died in the greater Middle East and the Ottoman Empire. This was the main man-made cause of civilian death in the First World War, actually, starvation by blockade. So the memory of this was very live before the advent of nuclear weapons, before the advent of chemical weapons used on civilians or 4-engine strategic bombers. Blockade was the main instrument with which countries in the early 20th century had shown that they could kill large amounts of civilians quickly. So that's very important to realize when we think of deterrence, it's not an empty term. It was actually something that lived in the memory of societies. It had left marks in terms of stunted development of younger generations, lower birth rates, medical issues that were well documented. So threatening this instrument was very powerful indeed. And when in 1921 a border war broke out between Yugoslavia and Albania, the League of Nations threatened to use sanctions, and the mere threat actually helped. They were never imposed. Yugoslavia withdrew, and a League Commission was sent out to fix the border between these countries. So the threat of sanctions had worked successfully. 4 years later, a similar incident, the very funnily named War of the Stray Dog, which you could imagine what led to this war breaking out at the border of Greece and Bulgaria, was also diffused through the threat of sanctions. And a final important case was in the summer of 1940, when Britain and the United States together briefly cut off oil supplies to Franco's Spain, thereby preventing him from joining the Second World War on the side of the Axis. They managed to actually convince him that it was in his material interest to stay neutral, and just by showing very briefly that they could control essentially all of the oil supply going into Spain. This is, of course, a very similar timeline to the sanctions against Japan. So I'm happy to answer more questions about that. But what was clear by the 1930s with these successful deterrent uses of sanctions was that actually the League of Nations, long maligned by historians and by posterity as a very weak institution, had a pretty overwhelming share of the world's resources. These are some key minerals, and both before and after the Great Depression, the League of Nations really maintains a preponderant share, at least 4 times as many, even by the late 1930s, as the challenging coalition of the Axis, or before that, the Anti-Comintern Pact in 1936. So given that was such a strong dominant group, how come then that the League actually failed to stop the Second World War? Now, a large part of this perception that the League failed to prevent World War II was shaped by a book that came out right before, E.H. Carr's classic text of international relations, The 20 Years Crisis, in which Carr argued that the League was weak because it couldn't back up its economic sanctions with military power. And he essentially said that sanctions were a kind of paper tiger, they didn't mean much, the countries lacked the will to carry them out. Rather, if we look at these crises, I think in a more historical and more fine-grained perspective, and we compare the perspectives from the sanctioning and the sanctioned countries, and this interactive process between threats and reactions to it, what we can see is that the reason sanctions didn't work is not because they were weak, but because they were very difficult to calibrate in this dynamic, crisis-ridden environment of the world in the 30s, which was going through the Great Depression. There were a lot of uncertainties, but it was very difficult given that this instrument had recently been created and had been lifted out of its association with war into the realm of peace to use this instrument without triggering the memories of the war, triggering the fears that war was imminent. And so how to calibrate it, whether sanctions had to be soft in order to avoid escalation, or whether the threat had to be all powerful precisely to make sure that war would not break out. That was the key question. And so the Carrian assumption that failure is due to weakness, I think, is wrong. Rather, the failure of sanctions has much to do with the fact that excessive strength as well as weakness were possibilities with sanctions. It's the fact that it was very difficult to plan in advance and to foresee whether sanctions would exactly have the intended effect on the country they were being used against in this very dynamic environment. It was possible to overshoot or to kind of over-egg the strength of sanctions as well as to undershoot. And it's that, I think, that accounts for why this crisis ends up escalating so much in the 1930s. And this is what in the book I call the sanctions autarky spiral, because of course there were big pre-existing agendas for empire building in Japan, in Italy, and in Nazi Germany. But what sanctions did was, rather than trying to make it obvious that the League would always have a dominant share of the world's resources, sanctions actually accelerated the search for a kind of zone of resources that would be immune from blockade, that would be secure against interdiction through sanctions. And in the 30s, the thought was that territorial empire, capturing territory that had a lot of resources, was the key to that. Japan, of course, had invaded Manchuria since the 30s, but it also continued to push into China later in the 30s with the idea of establishing an autarkic zone in East Asia. And sanctions then end up creating an escalatory spiral in which the threat of sanctions makes the need or the desire to gather those resources that will render you self-sufficient more urgent. That requires invasion and aggression. That triggers more sanctions, that makes the target even more desperate. And so we can see this cycle really kicking off, beginning with Italy's invasion of Ethiopia, which triggered major sanctions by the League of Nations. And even though those sanctions failed to stop the war, they did lead Italy to embrace autarky in a very intensified and new way. And the Italian autarky measures were studied already by the Japanese in the summer of 1936. So there are already Japanese technocrats from the Ministry of Trade at that point visiting Italy to study these new anti-sanctionist techniques. At the same moment, in the spring and summer of 1936, Hitler announces the 4-year plan, which explicitly says that Germany needs to be self-sufficient in terms of fuel supplies, and ready for war in 4 years, and self-sufficient in fuel supplies within 18 months, so the spring of 1938. And by the end of the decade, Germany is openly boasting in English language propaganda of its ability to resist any future pressure now, because it has created this zone of influence, either by expanding into new territories or by subjugating small states in Eastern Europe in unequal trade agreements. And finally, of course, this is a story with which you will be very familiar, so I won't rehash it here. Japan, which is heavily dependent on maritime supply lines. The fact that the British Empire turns more protectionist means that Japan becomes ever more dependent economically as the 30s go on the United States, the one remaining neutral country in the world at that point. And so if you look at the development of Japanese imports, you can see that the share of the US in that grows tremendously towards the end of the decade. And that then, of course, means that sanctions, once the US begins to impose them actively on Japan in 1940, become an existential question for Japan. It's no longer able to expand into other world markets. Its war in China has run aground and no longer seems to be delivering the results that it wants. And its one major import partner now begins to tighten the economic screws on it. And this, of course, it creates a very charged environment for the debates within the Japanese elite about what to do. And ultimately, it's the hardliners that win that debate, in part because of this pressure that gives them a strong argument that allows them to prevail over the more compromise-oriented factions. So I think that it's that dynamism of these regimes as well that we need to take very seriously. These are polycratic regimes, and sanctions at particular moments can tip the scales decisively in favor of the autarky argument or in favor of the escalation argument, even though that's not their intention. That has been historically their effect in some cases. So I see that I'm approaching the end of my time. I just want to sum up a few final conclusions, but before I do that, one person who I think really described this extremely well in the late 30s and early 40s is one of the great East Asian economic specialists of that decade, Elizabeth Budi Schumpeter. Some of you might know her for the study that she edited about Manchukuo in the 1930s, which was very much focused on the goals that Japan had in that region. But she also foresaw that there was this escalation spiral, and she analyzed it in real time and was consistently in the US trying to influence the debate towards some sort of agreement between the US and Japan. And she said very clearly that there was a very involved relationship between economic pressure, the threat of sanctions, policies of autarky, and territorial aggression, which acted on each other with cumulative force. Her other insight, I think, is that international organizations, she was a supporter of the League having sanctions and of using sanctions to enforce international law, respect for territorial integrity. But she said, there must be a right that is recognized to economic expansion for all countries. If you are going to keep the territorial status quo intact and defend it as legitimate, you must allow all countries in the world to expand commercially and industrially. And when you both defend the territorial status quo and you take away the future or the prospect of economic growth for those countries at the same time, then you create a very tense and difficult situation. And that's what she said is the basis of real collective security. And in the 1940s, of course, under US hegemony, an international economy was established that did enable growth by almost all countries in the world. And so I think that accounts for some of the stability of US hegemony after World War II. It is, of course, a question if that could have been achieved in the 30s, but it's a very important one, I think, that we need to bear in mind today, of course, when we have on the one hand reached a level of trade integration that is much higher than in the interwar period. That's good news. I think it means we're much more interdependent. There's a lot more interconnection between societies that will survive and that we have to destroy if we want to go back to this kind of bloc autarkic world of the 30s. But we've also used many more sanctions. And that raises the question, when you look at, Russia is already one example, where the threat of sanctions in the run-up to the war did not deter them from aggression. There were very overt and explicit sanction threats by Biden and European allies in the fall and winter of 2021 and last winter, and yet they did not managed to create an environment in which some preservation of the status quo in Eastern Europe was able to come to pass. Of course, China and Taiwan, right, is an issue that there's been a lot of debate about as well. And there we're starting to see signs also that this quest for autarky is also being put on an accelerated footing. And I think that Elizabeth Schumpeter's arguments are really worth bearing in mind here. I think it's very important to hang on to the integrity and the independence of Taiwan. But at the same time now, there are policies that are being embarked upon that openly seem to limit Chinese economic growth in important sectors. And so if we use her framework for a moment, we should ask ourselves, if we want territorial expansion to be prevented, how do we ensure a positive, common, inclusive vision in East Asia and in the world for economic growth that all countries can participate in? How do we recreate that positive sum dynamic of US hegemony in the 40s and the post-war period? And there, the issue I think now is that, as you can see from the graph on the left, trade integration has slowed, has slightly reversed. So it's quite difficult now yet to really make a credible claim that there will be more economic growth and more trade growth in the future. We need to have a positive view and be able to deliver a positive vision of such a future, I think, because only if there is a future in which prosperity continues to be based on trade, does the threat of depriving countries from that prosperity have real power. If trade and if the benefits from trade are tapering off anyway, there's not that much to lose by withdrawing inward. So I think those are some of the issues that I would put up for discussion right now. And I've already reached my time, but thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to the questions.
Thank you for this fascinating presentation. I recall when I first went to the Yushukan Museum of History, the memorial of all who died in wars in Japan, that their trajectory of the path to war includes sanctions with a high profile, because there are conflicted interpretations with those who would say that was a declaration of war versus that was simply an act of policy. And your book puts so much context on the Japanese history in terms of it was right at this time that it was a transition from a new instrument that used to be a weapon of war and might have been perceived as that by some, but at that time had all of the legitimacy of the League of Nations to prevent war and ensure peace. But you've shown convincingly how it has many different implications. As you think about the assurance that in order to not have a sanction push countries to autarky, you need to think the counterfactual, the idea of if only they had been told they could continue to have access to markets, would that have led to different choices? Do you think that those debates were recognized when countries were imposing sanctions? Like, how attuned were they to the reaction in other countries? And especially when there wasn't as much information about these other countries, do you think that there was knowing sense that this was going to push them on that path, or it was unintended consequences?
That's a very good question. The analysts at the time, I think, were quite divided on this. And you're right that a lot of their expectations about what sanctions would do were also based on stereotypes about national character and race that were very prevalent in the interwar period. But from an economic point of view, and this is, I think, also a well-established fact about the Great Depression, is that it creates a lot of international coordination problems. Beggar thy neighbor policies become very attractive, and many countries, including the North Atlantic allies. I mean, at the time, right, the US isn't really part of the North Atlantic allies because it's a neutral power. It's outside of the League of Nations. It's economically all important. It's already the largest economy in the world, but it's very difficult to get everyone to agree. And even between the US, Britain, and France, there are continuous issues in the realm of trade and the realm of security guarantees all the way up to the end of the 30s. So one way of thinking about the interwar crisis is as a very multifaceted coordination problem. How does one get these different blocks of countries, some of whom are members of international institutions, others have left them? I remember you, of course, written about that too. Others have left them, others have just recently been allowed in. The Soviet Union, for example, is very important as Russia today as a commodity exporter. It enters the League of Nations in 1934, right as Germany and Japan leave. How does that change the balance? Well, it means that the League still has this big commodity power behind it. And indeed, of course, the Soviet Union plays a pivotal role in Allied victory in World War II. But at the time, it's not fully trusted in Western capitals. And that too, I think, accounts for some of the hesitance, right? There's still a very strong, people, I think, rightly distrust Stalin and his machinations, but there's also a deeply seated anti-communism in Western capitals that could not imagine any kind of cooperation, even though it had been clearly shown that to contain Germany, for example, the old Entente of the First World War, a Anglo-French-Russian alliance, which created a two-front kind of containment system, especially with smaller European countries involved, worked quite well. And it's, in a sense, the failure to recreate that in this new age of ideological tensions also, that I think that's an underlying narrative that, I don't maybe bring out fully, but that's definitely, I think, how we can see that bring.
Right, the coordination challenges, and they're present today too, is the US, Europe, Japan, and Korea may have seemed to prevent a solid front, but of course, achieving that was difficult, and there's many countries that don't join sanctions as do. So I think that continues to have implications. We have a question from one of our associates at the program on U.S. Japan Relations. Shigeki Moriyama is going to ask a question. He is from the Japanese Ministry of Finance, and currently he's doing research on debt and fiscal reform in Japan and the United States.
Thank you, Enrico. Thank you for your fascinating presentation. So I'm an economist, so I'm not well known about the history. So I made some mistakes, so please allow me to speak something. First of all, my understanding. As for the autarky, the station to the south in China is possible. And with the consent of the French government, Japan stationed the south in China. Therefore, at that time, Japan was very naive to that. This didn't affect the relation to the United States, but this caused the economic sanction. And the US, I think, was also very naive to that. This sanction would stop the military action by Japan, but unsuccessfully. So the economic sanction is very difficult. It's very, very effective. They might cause the unexpected outcomes, reaction. So, like under the current situation, so we impose North Korea to stop their building a capacity to launch nuclear missile, but almost in vain. So, how to enforce effectively to stop the attitude. And also, in case of Russia, the counter effect is very enormous. And the cost is very enormous. So, United States, they already suffer from the high price of oil and huge expenditure military support is in question. In addition to that, in the League of Nations, they said the victim support is important. Such a huge burden is also that the country to impose very difficult. So in terms of history, reaction of the economic sanction imposed and the enforcement effectiveness and the cost of the sanctions. That's what I want to hear from your comment. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, I will just touch on one thing that you mentioned, which is how they affect the decision making in that period. And I think that's my general point, that the understanding of sanctions in much of the literature and in our current day debates is much too mechanistic. The economics of it are very important, but we need to place that in a context of where does the center of gravity of the policy consensus in elites who have decision-making power lie, and how do sanctions affect those calculations? And there, of course, right, the polycratic nature of states is very important to take seriously, that there is no, states are not monoliths, they aren't unified actors. And even with Russia is a very good example that very clearly this invasion, it seems now, was decided upon by the security arm and the Kremlin itself, the security arm of the state, the security services, the army, but none of the civilian ministries had been informed. So the central bank and the Ministry of Finance were caught entirely blindsided. In the 1930s, both within Japan and on the Chinese side, of course, right, the Chinese situation within the nationalist camp, the relationship between the nationalists and the communists are vital too. And I think you're right that in the 30s, or in 1931, I think the kind of premeditated nature of the Manchurian invasion is quite clear. But by 1937, it is true that at that point, Chiang Kai-shek is not unwilling to escalate the situation because he sees growing Japanese power as something that makes it important to confront sooner rather than later Japan, around the time of the Marco Polo Bridge incident. So there too, it's a very dynamic environment. And perhaps one of the important things to take away from this is that timing is very important, and we cannot control the moment at which a situation arises in which sanctions may have to be imposed, but that moment might nonetheless be very unfortunate in a sense, or the incentives may not be structured by previous decisions and by political developments in such a way that they attain the desired effect, even when the same sanctions at a different moment may work very well. So that's a key thing. And of course, then today, the added difficulty is that we're also dealing with public opinion, where public opinion will push for sanctions to be ratcheted up in a way that makes it very difficult for this timing and flexibility at a diplomatic level to be optimal. Whereas ideally, you would want them to be imposed very quickly to make the threats credible, but also removed in order to keep some of the incentives of compliance alive. And right now, I think it's in many ways very impressive that 38 countries around the world have been able to agree on this international sanctions package against Russia. But it does raise questions about, imagine a future in which there is a Russian government that is willing to withdraw from Ukraine and have some sort of peace deal. How will we define the parameters for sanctions lifting when there are 38 countries involved in the lifting? The Iran sanctions deal, there were 5 countries imposing sanctions against one country, and that already took years of negotiations. One can imagine the diplomatic difficulty, right, of 38 countries agreeing on common standards for the lifting. So I think that's some of the diplomatic complexity that we should talk much more about than we are at the moment. Yeah.
Thank you.
We have some questions online. I want to take a few more from the room before I turn to our online audience. Yes, Martin Fackler.
Yeah, Martin Fackler. Thank you, Nick, for the talk. And I just wanted to ask if we could take the lessons that you've learned and spin them forward. The sanctions on China essentially cut off access to chips that are necessary, quarantine nanobytes and whatever NM and below necessary for quantum computing and AI and all these things. Are we facing a situation where we don't give China a way out, where we are at risk of driving them into not just like a dramatic autarkic move like Japan made 80 years ago? If you look at what history has taught you, are we at a dangerous moment with China? What do you think? What would be your analysis of the situation now?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that's a question on many people's minds, certainly also mine. I should say that I'm not an East Asia specialist, so there's some real caveats there, but I would say that ensuring some positive or leaving the space for a positive path that a country can take is very important. To fully boxing in seems to me a path that is risky, fraught with risk, particularly when China has obviously made economic growth central to its political legitimacy of the government, but it also is important for global stability. They're the large part of the G20 in the global South. Their entire economic growth models depend on China continuing to grow very rapidly, right? Commodity exporters, but also manufacturing centers, both East Asian countries and European countries. I'm Dutch myself. We have very heavily export-dependent economies, and it's a question whether we can adjust to a world in which China no longer exists as a growth engine. It would be nice to be able to use the United States as a growth engine, but the US mainly the US economic growth is mainly driven by domestic demand. So it's not clear to me that South Korea, Japan, Germany, the Netherlands, and the whole rest of the EU can all keep growing by just exporting to the United States, that we can substitute for that, particularly since our exports are a lot more expensive than China's. So that seems to me the risk right now. I think we're at a risky moment. I'm happy to hear that it seems like there today have been high-level talks again. Blinken's going to Beijing, or will speak with the Chinese. So definitely we should focus on the positive. But I think that that's why it's key to what's the positive sum growth dynamic that the US and China can be in that can, accommodate security concerns, reshoring, which I think is good. And there's a lot of legitimate domestic reasons to want to do that. But I hope that just, maybe not a very strong conclusion, but I think we're definitely at a moment where we need to think about what's the positive outcome that we want to achieve here, because just staying on top at whatever cost, that's not a vision, that's just sort of an impulse. And I think we need to think beyond that,
Hello, Jose Garcia from the Water Trade Center. Thank you very much for the presentation. It's very interesting. I have a question regarding the feasibility of sanctions in the current multipolar world. What we see today is that the supply chains are so global that quite often you try to impose sanctions and actually they backfire on the country that imposed them. So in your opinion, China may be a special case because the vision is more long-term, trying to slow down the technological developments in the country. But if we take as an example Russia and the backfiring of the sanctions in the European economies, do you think that it is still possible to implement effective sanctions when some big economies or key actors like China or India are not going to follow?
Let me rephrase just so that our online audience, sometimes our mic doesn't pick it up clearly. So if I can summarize the question, is in the current global setting, how will multilateral sanctions be effective? Because there's the risk of backfire harming the economies of major players, and not everyone will participate.
And the risk of circumvention, I would add.
Yes. We're certainly in a much more balanced global economy in terms of just the GDP size of different blocks, and that needs to be taken into account. Then compared to the mid-20th century, when really the first Europe and then the United States together particularly just had such a strong share of global GDP, which was the case for much of the Cold War too, and it's only been since the 70s, 80s that the growth of Asian economies particularly has rebalanced that to a significant degree. But I think, the answer is kind of frustrating because it's kind of in the middle. So I don't think that it is as easy as many countries think to escape some of the infrastructural dependence on US power, the dollar, bank clearance, SWIFT, these things. There are really serious reasons why most world trade is in dollars. So I don't think that these visions of a massive move away from the dollar as a reserve currency are quite going to come to pass very soon. That being said, at the margin, there are some developments that I think are more significant politically rather than economically. So when there's a rupee-ruble clearing mechanism between India and Russia, for example, which there was already in the Cold War, but they've revived it now, I think what the significance of that is that it sets up a mechanism that if the West wants to tighten pressure on Russia through secondary sanctions on India, it needs to then really burn a lot of its goodwill with the Indians. And that comes at a big cost if you also want the Indians to be on your side vis-a-vis China, for example. So those sorts of things, the same with Saudi Arabia and selling oil to China in yuan rather than in dollars, right? This is not in itself significant. It's not going to end dollars generally, but it means that if the US wants to cut off oil to China, it needs to then truly go against Saudi Arabia as well. So those, I think, are some of the obstacles we've seen. I think the conclusion for the last few years, the obstacles to sanctions implementation are not technical. The US particularly has real dominance there. It's translating that technical mastery into the political outcomes that you want to see. And that's actually about diplomacy and about politics. And I think that's why I was saying our understanding of sanctions is too mechanistic. We try and conclude from the technical dominance that any political outcome the US wants to see in the world can be realized through sanctions. And it's actually the transformation of those technical means into those political outcomes that proves to be the difficult part. Even very small economies like North Korea are, at a great cost to their own population, withstanding this pressure, and in fact continue to do all sorts of provocative stuff. So I think that's kind of where I would end up in, somewhere in the middle. Yeah.
Which leads to the questions in the online chat, a bit pushing on the morality and the harm to civilians, thinking about who makes the decision, what are the consequences for civilians, and what do we think about the effect of our democracies more or less able to impose sanctions? Are they more or less vulnerable to them? Within that, bringing in the moral dimension and the civilian impact, what do you think of comparing? Your book in the interwar period talks about Hoover asking for food ships to get an exception, and that proposal was rejected.
Yes.
Because there was this view of total war and imposed damage. Whereas now we're watching the discussion of grain ships, and everyone seems to agree there should be an exception for the grain ships. So I would add that on to this question of humanitarian impact. And
yes. The positive development, I think, is that sanctions have become much more granular. So individual sanctions, but also on individual firms, allow us to get out of some of the problems of big, sweeping country-level sanctions. So in a sense, we've given up on most of the sanctions used today are no longer the broad country-level based ones. We've given up on that idea that you just threaten the entire society and then you'll get the most dramatic outcome. Rather now, and particularly the Iraq sanctions in the 1990s led to this humanitarian fiasco, right, and a real tragedy, and that caused the shift to smart sanctions. Although some smart sanctions, it has to be said, continue to have much broader ripple effects. This is another major aspect where we need to look much more at business history and business decision making, because sanctions become internalized into the operations of businesses through the compliance departments who want to avoid legal trouble. Oftentimes, businesses will steer clear of perfectly legal transactions, and there was a big dip in fertilizer and grain exports, not just from Ukraine because Russia was blocking them, but from Russia too, because no international bank wanted to touch anything exported by Russia. And so Russian export of fertilizer and grains fell by 35% too in the first half of this year, even though there were never Western sanctions on it.
the challenge of calibration.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Factors piling on.
Yes. Yeah, so there's if the legal designation of sanctions is sort of the immediate economic explosion in the world economy, there are these much broader shockwaves through the corporate sector that emanate and that policymakers need to try and take into account. And it takes a while. After a while, and I think that's maybe the positive spin on the US tech and chip restrictions, companies will figure out that this does not mean that all semiconductor interdependence with China is gone immediately, and that there are still ways that they can kind of get around it, but it takes time for that to happen. And in the short run, some of the damage politically may be done. Yeah, so.
Right. And the shockwaves are not just material. You have that wonderful quote from Woodrow Wilson that it's not the material, it's the sense of fear and isolation. And
yes.
So the worry of how does China react, not just to losing the chips, but to the sense that they're being labeled an enemy.
Yes. Yeah, and then one final point there. Yeah, exactly. Well, today it seems maybe not the full enemy, which is good. But no, I think the other key thing of taking the corporate side of the corporate reaction seriously is that when we want sanctions to work and we want the lifting of them to work as a real carrot, one needs to be able to guarantee that business activity will resume and will go back. And that involves a much greater diplomatic and political effort to make exchange and trade with the former targets of sanctions legitimate again. With Iran, it was very clear that after the Iran deal was announced, it was possible to trade again with Iran, but many companies were reluctant to go back. That really reduced the economic benefits to Iran of re-entry. And I think it's a clear reason why they now are in no hurry to get back into a deal, because they saw much less of an economic recovery than they had hoped, because many Western compliance departments and Western banks and firms still were very uncertain that maybe sanctions will be reimposed. And for them, they had been operating in an environment where for decades Iran was a pariah and they couldn't touch it, right? And so that too, the legacy effects of this, the longer the sanctions are in place, the more difficult it will be to revive trade. And yet that is actually key to making it work. So we need to think proactively, what if sanctions are economic war, what does post-sanctions, post-war reconstruction mean, right? After a war, we have reconstruction policies, but after economic war, we also need specific reconstruction policies. Yeah.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Thank you so very much.
Thank you.
Really a pleasure to have you join us.
Thank you.